Frank Sinatra had 72 hours to live. The debt collectors weren't waiting any longer. But what they didn't know was that Dean Martin had been watching from the shadows, and what he did next shocked even the mob bosses who thought they controlled Vegas. December 15th, 1962. The Sands Hotel and Casino was the beating heart of Las Vegas, where dreams were made and fortunes were lost, with the flip of a card. But on this particular Friday night, something was different. The usual electricity in the air felt heavy, dangerous. The high rollers at the baccarat tables weren't laughing. The waitresses moved with nervous energy. Even the slot machines seemed to ring with a hollow, ominous tone. Frank Sinatra was supposed to be on stage in 30 minutes. The chairman of the board, the leader of the Rat Pack, the man who owned Las Vegas. But Frank wasn't in his dressing room, preparing. He wasn't warming up his voice or adjusting his tie. Frank Sinatra was sitting in the back office of the Sands, staring at a piece of paper that might as well have been his death warrant. It was a debt notice? Not from a bank? Not from the IRS? From people who didn't send second notices? From people who collected with baseball bats and concrete shoes? The number at the bottom made Frank's hands shake. $280,000. In 1962 money that was over $2 million today. Money Frank didn't have. Money Frank couldn't get. Money that would cost him everything. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Here's the secret that the Rat Pack took to their graves. Frank Sinatra wasn't the tough guy everyone thought he was. When real danger came knocking, when real violence was on the table, Frank was just a scared kid from Hoboken who sang pretty songs. The man who really ran things. The man who had the backbone, the connections and the ice-cold nerves to handle the worst Vegas had to offer. That was Dean Martin. And on this night, Dean was about to prove it in a way that would save Frank's life and change the power structure of the underworld forever. The trouble had started 6 months earlier. Frank's ego had gotten him into a poker game he couldn't afford. Not a friendly game with movie stars and oil executives. A serious game in the back room of a Chicago restaurant, where the stakes weren't chips, they were territory. Frank thought he was untouchable. He thought his fame was a shield. His connections were armor. He was wrong. The game was run by Anthony Big Tuna Accardo, the boss of the Chicago outfit. Accardo didn't care about show business. He didn't collect autographs. He collected debts. When Frank lost big that night, when he signed IOUs with nothing but his signature to back them up, he sealed his fate. For 6 months, Frank had been making payments. Small amounts. Interest payments. Buying time. But the principal never went down. It only grew. And now, Accardo was done waiting. The word had come down from Chicago. Collect in full or make an example. 72 hours. Final notice. Frank had tried everything. He'd called his movie studio contacts, begged for advances on pictures that didn't exist yet. He'd reached out to wealthy friends who suddenly weren't taking his calls. He'd even considered going to the FBI, but that was suicide in a different way. In 1962, the feds couldn't protect him from the mob. They'd just make him a target for both sides. Sitting in that office, chain-smoking Camels and nursing a scotch that had gone warm in his trembling hand, Frank felt truly alone for the first time in his adult life. The phone on the desk might as well have been a time bomb. When it rang, it would be Accardo's people. When it rang, the countdown would begin. But Frank wasn't alone. He just didn't know it yet. 3 floors above in the penthouse suite that the Sands kept permanently reserved for him, Dean Martin was getting dressed for dinner. To anyone watching, he looked like a man without a care in the world. He adjusted his cufflinks with the same casual precision he brought to everything. He selected his tie with the eye of a man who understood that style was about confidence, not fashion. He was the picture of cool elegance. But Dean's eyes were different that night. They had the sharp, calculating look of a man who was planning something, because Dean Martin knew about Frank's problem. He'd known about it for weeks, and while Frank had been panicking, scheming, begging, Dean had been watching and waiting and thinking. Dean Martin didn't solve problems the way other people did. He didn't make phone calls or send lawyers or negotiate through intermediaries. Dean solved problems the way he played golf, with patience, precision, and perfect timing. And tonight, it was time to make his move. The elevator ride down to the casino floor was silent. Dean rode alone, watching the numbers count down like a man descending into hell with a plan to rearrange the furniture. When the doors opened, he stepped into the controlled chaos of the Sands main floor. The energy hit him immediately. The sound of chips clicking, cards shuffling, ice clinking in glasses. But underneath it all, Dean could feel the tension. Word was spreading. Frank Sinatra was in trouble. Big trouble. Dean walked through the casino like he owned it. Which in a way he did. Not officially, not on paper, but in the way that mattered in Vegas. The dealers nodded respectfully. The pit bosses stepped aside. The waitresses smiled. Dean Martin commanded respect, not through fear or bluster, but through something much more powerful, absolute authenticity. In a city built on illusion, Dean Martin was exactly who he appeared to be. He walked past the blackjack tables, where he'd once worked as a dealer in illegal Ohio gambling dens. He walked past the roulette wheels that reminded him of carnival midways in his youth. He walked straight to the high-limit room where the real business of Vegas was conducted. The room where legends were born and destroyed with equal indifference. The high-limit room was a different world. Quieter, darker, more dangerous. The men who gambled here didn't do it for fun. They did it for power, for territory, for respect. The minimum bet was more than most people made in a year. The maximum bet was whatever you could afford to lose, or couldn't afford to lose. And sitting at the head table, playing baccarat with the cold concentration of a surgeon, was Vincent the Fish Torino, Anthony Accardo's enforcer. Torino was in Vegas for one reason: to collect Frank Sinatra's debt or arrange Frank Sinatra's funeral. He'd been waiting all week for Frank to come crawling, begging for more time, offering anything to stay alive. Instead, Dean Martin pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Evening, Vinny," Dean said, his voice carrying that familiar lazy warmth. "Mind if I sit in?" Torino looked up. He was a small man with dead fish eyes and hands that had broken more bones than a doctor had set. He wasn't impressed by celebrities. He'd killed men richer and more famous than Dean Martin. But there was something in Dean's manner, something in the way he sat down without invitation, that made Torino pause. "This is a private game, Singer," Torino said, his Chicago accent thick as concrete. "Maybe you should go practice your scales." Dean smiled. Not the charming stage smile that made women swoon. This was a different smile. Colder, more dangerous. "I'm not here to practice anything, Vinny. I'm here to settle a debt." The other players at the table suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. They gathered their chips and faded into the background like smoke. In seconds, it was just Dean and Torino, staring at each other across green felt that might as well have been a battlefield. "What debt is that?" Torino asked, though they both knew exactly what debt Dean was talking about. Dean reached into his jacket. For a moment, Torino's hand moved toward his own jacket, where a .38 special waited in a shoulder holster. But Dean's hand emerged with something much more dangerous than a gun, a checkbook. "Frank's debt," Dean said simply. "The full amount, plus interest, plus whatever you call a settlement fee for the inconvenience." Torino laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "You're gonna pay Sinatra's debt? With a check? Do I look like a bank to you, Dino?" Dean opened the checkbook. His fountain pen, a gift from his daughter, caught the light from the chandelier above. "You look like a businessman, Vinny, and I'm making you an offer." "What makes you think I want your money instead of Sinatra's blood?" Dean wrote a number on the check. He didn't show it to Torino, but he spoke as he wrote, "Because blood doesn't spend, because Frank owes you $280,000. But this check is for $500,000. Because your boss didn't send you here to start a war with the Rat Pack. He sent you here to make money." Dean tore the check from the book and placed it face down on the table. "And because if you turn this down, if you touch one hair on Frank's head, you're not just dealing with a singer anymore. You're dealing with me." The room had gone completely silent. Even the distant sounds of the casino seemed muted. Torino stared at the check, then at Dean. "What's so special about you, Martin? You think you're tough because you're from Ohio?" Dean leaned back in his chair. He lit a cigarette, taking his time, letting the silence stretch. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Vinny, You know who Joey Gallo is? Torino's eyes narrowed. Joey Crazy Joe Gallo was one of the most feared hitmen in New York, a psychopath who killed for pleasure as much as profit. Joey owed me a favor, Dean continued. Big favor. I could call him right now, have him fly out here tonight. But I won't. You know why? Torino said nothing. Because I like you, Vinny. You're just doing your job. So I'm giving you a choice. Take the check. Tell your boss Frank's debt is paid with interest. And we all go home happy. Or, Dean's voice dropped even lower. Or find out why they call me the King of Cool. And trust me, Vinny, it's not because of my singing voice. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Dean Martin, the entertainer who pretended to be drunk on stage, but was stone-cold sober in life. Vincent Torino, the killer who'd never back down from anyone. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Then Torino reached across the table and flipped the check over. His eyes widened. Dean hadn't just written $500,000. He'd written $750,000. $750,000, more money than Torino had ever seen in one place.
Jesus Christ.
Martin, Torino breathed. You're serious. Dead serious, Dean replied. Frank's my friend. I don't let friends get hurt when I can prevent it. Torino picked up the check, studied it, held it up to the light. It was real. Dean Martin's personal account, signed and dated. Enough money to make Anthony Accardo very, very happy. This clears Sinatra's debt completely? Torino asked. Completely. And if anyone from Chicago ever bothers him again over old business, they answer to me. Personally. Torino folded the check and put it in his breast pocket. You know, Martin, you're not what I expected.
What did you expect?
A drunk who tells jokes. Dean smiled, but this time it was his genuine smile. Warm, charming, disarming. That's just my day job, Vinny. 3 hours later, Frank Sinatra stood on the stage of the Copa Room, completely unaware that his life had just been saved. He sang I've Got You Under My Skin with his usual swagger, unaware that the men in the front row who'd been planning his funeral were now wondering if they should ask Dean Martin for his autograph. Dean watched from the back of the room, nursing an apple juice that looked like scotch. He didn't tell Frank what had happened. He never told Frank what had happened, because that wasn't Dean's style. Dean Martin didn't rescue people for gratitude or recognition. He rescued them because it was the right thing to do. But the story doesn't end there, because word spreads fast in Vegas, faster in the underworld. Within a week, every mob boss from New York to Los Angeles knew what had happened. They knew that Dean Martin had quietly, efficiently solved a problem that could have destroyed the entertainment capital of the world. They knew he'd done it without violence, without drama, without even raising his voice. More importantly, they knew that beneath the relaxed exterior, beneath the jokes and the songs and the cocktails, Dean Martin was someone you didn't mess with. Not because he was violent, but because he was smart, smarter than they were. And in a world where violence was common, intelligence was rare and therefore terrifying. From that night forward, the Rat Pack operated under Dean's protection, whether they knew it or not. Frank continued to be Frank, loud, brash, sometimes reckless, but he was never threatened again, because everyone knew that threatening Frank meant dealing with Dean. And dealing with Dean meant playing a game where the rules weren't written in blood, they were written in pure, calculating intelligence. Years later, when Frank was old and sick and his voice was failing, he would sometimes look at Dean and wonder how many times Dean had saved him. Wonder how many debts Dean had quietly paid. Wonder how many enemies Dean had turned into friends with nothing more than a conversation and a check. Frank never found out the truth. Dean never told him. Because the greatest act of friendship isn't the one that gets recognition. It's the one that remains forever in the shadows, protecting the people you love from dangers they never even knew existed. On Christmas Day, 1995, when Dean Martin drew his last breath in his Beverly Hills home, he took many secrets with him. But perhaps the greatest secret was this. He wasn't just the king of cool. He was the guardian angel of Vegas. The man who kept the peace not with guns or threats, but with the simple understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is write a check and walk away. The next time you hear "That's Amore," or watch Dean Martin sway on stage with that easy smile, remember this story. Remember the night he saved Frank Sinatra's life without firing a shot, without raising his voice, without asking for anything in return except the knowledge that he'd done the right thing. That was Dean Martin, cool, calm, and secretly one of the most dangerous men in America. Dangerous not because he could hurt you, but because he could outsmart you, outmaneuver you, and defeat you before you even realized you were in a fight. And in a world full of tough guys with guns, sometimes the most powerful weapon is a man with a checkbook and the wisdom to know when to use it.